Quincy, Massachusetts. January 1st, 1812. An old man sits down at a wooden desk and picks up a pen he hasn't used for this purpose in 11 years. He's about to write, to the man he spent the last decade of his life hating. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about presidential rivals. Sometimes the public feud is completely real. And the private relationship survives it anyway. The guy about to break 11 years of silence, former president. The guy he's writing to, also a former president. Also his oldest friend. Also the man he once called dangerous to the entire republic. This is U.S. presidents who secretly loved their rivals. But first, let's rewind a couple hundred years and 8 rivalries before we get back to that desk. Number 8. Obama and McCain. We're starting modern because it's the easiest one to relate to. Two guys spend an entire campaign attacking each other's judgment, experience, and vision for the country on national television. That's not the twist. The twist is what happened after the cameras turned off. Years later, Obama talked openly about private meetings with McCain at the White House. Meetings where the disagreements didn't magically disappear, Chief. They just stopped being the whole relationship. Because here's the causal chain. They'd spent months as opponents, which meant they'd actually studied each other closely, which meant that once the election ended, there was nothing left to perform. No cameras to win over. Just two guys who already knew exactly how the other one thought. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this whole video promises secretly loved, and Obama McCain isn't a secret letter-writing operation. There's no hidden shoebox of romantic campaign trail correspondence here. What it actually is proof that respect and agreement are two completely different things. You can lose every ballot in the country and still keep the guy's number in your phone. That's rivalry number 8. Not a secret, just a boundary. Compare that to our next guy, who didn't just tolerate his rival. He needed him to survive the worst week of his presidency. Number 7. Lyndon Johnson and Dwight Eisenhower. November 22, 1963. Lyndon Johnson becomes president in the worst possible way. Kennedy's just been assassinated, and Johnson has hours, not months, to figure out how to lead a country in shock on live television. So who does he call? Not another Democrat. He calls Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican president he'd spent years opposing politically, because Eisenhower had actually run a 5-star military campaign in Europe, which meant he'd made life-or-death calls under pressure before Johnson had even entered national politics. That's the whole chain right there. Crisis creates a need. Need overrides party loyalty. Party loyalty felt like the most important thing in the world on November 21st. By November 22nd, it just didn't matter. Eisenhower gave him the advice anyway. No hesitation, no political price tag attached. Two men from opposite political tribes. And in the worst week of Johnson's life, the entire two-party system just stopped mattering. It's the same pattern we just saw with Obama and McCain. Respect. Surviving disagreement. But our next pair takes that idea somewhere a lot funnier. And honestly, a lot pettier. Because these two were still actively trying to destroy each other in public while this was happening. Number 6. Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas. Lincoln and Douglas are tearing each other apart across Illinois in one of the most famous political showdowns in American history. Sometimes 15,000 people would show up just to watch these two argue outdoors for 3 hours straight. Lincoln's the underdog. Douglas is the nationally famous senator he's chasing. All right, settle down. I paid good money to hear this man get destroyed. That's basically the energy of an 1858 debate crowd, Chief, and I stand by it. Here's the part that gets left out. While they're publicly wrecking each other's arguments in front of thousands of people, they're also having dinner together, negotiating debate schedules like two guys splitting a lease. Lincoln wrote Douglas directly to set up the debates, and even mid-insult, signed the letter, "Your obedient servant," because that's just what you did back then, even to a man you were actively trying to destroy. Translation: It's basically the 1858 version of ending a furious work email with "best regards." Douglas later stood on a debate stage and told the crowd, in his own words, that the two of them were just as good personal friends as he was with anyone else in politics. Publicly. Mid-feud. Chief, that's either the most secure man in American history or the most confusing frenemy situation of the 1800s. 'Cause, honestly, I think it's option 2. Now, I gotta flag something here, and I'm only doing this once, so let's use it. Was this actual friendship or just 1800s political theater? Historians genuinely go back and forth. I'll let you decide. That's the halfway mark. And things are about to get a lot less formal. Number 5. Richard Nixon and Donald Trump. Okay, Chief, I need you to picture something with me. It's the 1980s. Richard Nixon, disgraced, resigned, one of the most controversial ex-presidents in American history, starts writing letters to a New York real estate developer. Not a politician, not yet. Just a guy building buildings and getting famous for it. This wasn't a one-time thing. It went on for roughly a decade. Personal letters, invitations, advice. The Nixon Library has literally exhibited over a dozen of them. More surviving personal correspondence than Nixon left with some of his own cabinet members. Here's the causal chain. Nixon needed relevance after resigning in disgrace, which meant he started paying attention to rising public figures, which meant he noticed a loud, camera-friendly developer years before that developer had any political ambitions at all. Imagine getting unsolicited career advice from Richard Nixon before you even have a campaign slogan. That's not a rivalry story. That's a prequel nobody asked for. I'm gonna stay neutral here, because this pair touches modern politics, and I'm not in the business of picking sides. I'm just the guy who reads the letters. Weird timeline we're all living in. Anyway, let's go back further, because our next pair didn't just write letters. One of them handed the other the presidency, and then took it back. Number 4. Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. Before there was a feud, there was a friendship. And honestly, Chief, that's the part that makes this one hurt. Roosevelt didn't just tolerate Taft as a successor. He personally chose him, campaigned for him, wrote him constantly about appointments, allies, and strategy. The kind of letters you write to someone you actually trust. Roosevelt expected to stay influential after leaving office because he'd built the guy's entire political career from the ground up. Move over, kid. I'll show you how it's done. That's basically how Roosevelt operated for the first few years, Chief, and Taft let him, right up until he didn't. Which is great news for me, actually, because I've definitely tried to micromanage a project I handed off. And it never goes great. Here's the chain that turns this into a tragedy. Roosevelt kept advising. Taft slowly started making his own calls. Roosevelt felt sidelined. Roosevelt started questioning Taft's judgment in public, and Taft finally had enough. By 1912, the mentor and the protege were full-blown presidential rivals. Roosevelt ran against the man he'd personally elevated to the highest office in the country. And the split was so bitter it fractured the entire Republican Party. Here's the number that shows how far the fall went. Taft, the man Roosevelt had personally installed in the Oval Office, finished the 1912 election with 8 electoral votes. 8 out of nearly 500. Not a loss, a collapse. And Roosevelt caused it. That's the most tragic entry on this list. But we're about to hit the wholesome exhale this whole video's been building toward. So take a breath, because you're gonna need it less than you think. Number 3. Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. Ford loses the presidency to Carter after one term. Normally, that's where the story ends. Not these two. Years later, the US government sends both former presidents together to represent the country at Anwar Sadat's funeral. And somewhere on that trip, something clicks. Shared duty forces proximity. Proximity turns into conversation. Conversation turns into respect. And respect turns into an honest-to-God friendship. They start traveling together. working on humanitarian projects side by side. Their wives, Betty Ford and Rosalind Carter, become genuinely close too. Two entire families, built out of what started as one of the more forgettable election rivalries in modern history. Chief, if you're gonna lose the presidency to somebody, we became vacation buddies for the next 3 decades is about the best case scenario you could ask for. Speaking of the channel, since Carter and Ford both spent their post-presidency helping other people, you can help this channel by hitting subscribe. That's the only ask you're getting from me all video, so make it count. Alright, from family friendship to a note left on a desk that changed how we think about losing gracefully. Number 2. George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, January 20th, 1993. Bush is leaving the White House. Not because he wanted to, Clinton beat him in an election Bush had genuinely expected to win. And on his way out, Bush does something a lot of defeated incumbents wouldn't bother with. He leaves Clinton a private, handwritten note on the Resolute desk for the man who just ended his presidency. The note was simple. Bush told Clinton his success would now become the country's success. Because for Bush, in that moment, the office mattered more than his own bruised ego. Bush had just spent months campaigning against everything Clinton stood for. Every reason to walk out bitter. He didn't. This isn't the first time in this video powers changed hands like that, Chief. And it's definitely not the last. Because our final entry isn't just about a note. It's about the letter that started an entire tradition of ex-presidents writing to each other, instead of never speaking again. Number 1. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Here's where we land back at that desk in Quincy. Adams and Jefferson helped build the country together, arguing their way through the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence itself. Then the election of 1800, one of the ugliest campaigns of the entire founding era, turned them into open enemies. For roughly 11 years afterward, they didn't speak. Not a letter, not a word. Then, January 1st, 1812, Adams picks up the pen, and Jefferson writes back. What follows is 14 years of letters. Hundreds of them, passing between Quincy and Monticello. Here's the chain that makes this the best entry on the whole list. 11 years is enough time for almost any grudge to lose its heat. Which meant that when the first letter finally arrived, there was nothing left to prove. And nothing left to defend. Just two elderly former presidents talking about religion, memory, philosophy, and their competing versions of the founding they'd both lived through. In his final letter to Adams, written in March of 1826, Jefferson looked back on their entire generation. The hardship of their youth under colonial rule, and the labor of tearing free from it. And then, because history apparently has a sense of drama, both men died on the exact same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of American independence. Out of roughly 250 years this country has existed, exactly one pair of former presidents has ever died on the same calendar day, and it's these two. On the one day that belonged to both of them equally. 14 years of letters, 11 years of silence before that, and a single shared last day. Right down to the date. Chief, I've read a lot of letters. That one still gets me every time. So that's the countdown. From a modern rivalry that never became a secret friendship, all the way to two founders who spent a decade in silence and then spent the rest of their lives making up for it. If Bush's note taught us anything, it's that some of the most important words in presidential history never got said out loud at all. They got written down. And there are a lot more of those letters we didn't get to. That's exactly what we're covering in The Letters Presidents Left Behind. Click that next, and I'll see you there.